Welcome to What's the Point? A question we should all be asking ourselves, and the podcast by brand architect Bill Ellis.
Welcome back to What's the Point? I'm your host, Bill Ellis, and today we're going to be addressing a topic that affects all of us, either directly or indirectly, and that very simply is trauma. We all have trauma in our life, and today we're going to find out from trauma-informed leadership coach and consultant how to handle trauma through her experience. And that's something I believe we'll all benefit from. So without any further ado, here's today's guest, Gigi Khonyongwa-Fernandez. Hi, Gigi.
Hello, you did it perfectly. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you. I'll give myself a gold star. But and for those listening, it is Gigi and not Gigi. So just to understand that, because it's certainly very unique. And Gigi is very unique, and she's got a very unique story. And Gigi, I've got to thank you for bringing this to us and to the public, because it can't be easy to be talking about what you've gone through. But the fact that you're doing it, I suspect, is part of your healing and progressing through it. Tell us a little bit about, please, your personal story, if you will.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to our time today. How long is a piece of string? I think because all of us have these never ending stories. But I guess for me, for our purposes today, my story is that I lost 4 pregnancies and some in the second trimester. And I have a son who was born at 24 weeks, so 4 months early at 645 grams, which is roughly a pound, so about the size of your hand. And I also lost his twin. So multiple layers of things happening, the unexpected happening, I guess, for the better way of putting it. And then my son, unfortunately, lost most of his vision as an infant because of the oxygen that he needed in order to survive. So he has a condition that is called retinopathy prematurity that caused his retinas to detach. So I guess layer after layer after layer within this sort of unexpected parenting journey, it just sort of knocked you for 6. And so I think it really caused me to go to a dark space, because a lot of what was supposed to happen didn't, and what wasn't supposed to happen did. And so I think it was a very surreal space to be in, because no one tells you, no one, like trauma in anything, is sort of unexpected, but no one would say to you, oh, in order, your parenting journey is going to include 4 babies who won't live, 1 baby who's severely, who can be sick for many, many years and would lose his sight. Where do you sign up? So
Yeah.
none of us would sign up to that. So that's sort of the ethos of that part of my journey, and the reason why I'm wanting to share it, as well as with other parents and professionals, to sort of help others move forward. And you used the word healing, and that's paramount for me.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And that certainly is no doubt trauma. It's got to be trauma to lose one unborn child, but to have 4 pregnancies all end with an unborn child, or as you call them, your angels.
Yes, my angel.
It has to.
babies.
I mean, I honestly can't fathom that. And
I couldn't either, actually. I think one of the reasons that it was also difficult is it's something that's not talked about. And so, and even no matter where you lose, if you lose, there's not a word if you lose a child. There's a word if you lose a spouse. There's a word if you lose your parents. There's it's an orphan or widow, but there's not a word for, if you lose your child at any point of that journey. And so it's something, because it's so unnatural, we don't really know how to express it. And those worlds of bereavement and sort of being, we were in a NICU for 6 months with multiple things going on there. That's a very unreal space. And then also having a son who's incredible, but he has additional needs that we have to think about because we live in a sighted world and he doesn't have his, full sight. So I think it's one of the things about trauma is sometimes I call it like feeling like you're being sucker punched, because just as soon as you sort of begin to try to take a breath, another one gets knocked out. It gets knocked down, you get knocked down. And so that's why I say that sort of multi-layered aspect of trauma. But I think because it is a subject that is often unspoken, people tend to feel shame within that. They already
That's what I
feel
was going to
trauma.
ask you to elaborate on. It hadn't occurred to me that there isn't a name, a designation, an awareness of what a mother or a mother and father must go through in that situation. And I was going to ask if you would share with us kind of what your range of feelings were. Did you have shame or blame or guilt? And also, if you're comfortable speaking on his behalf, share with us how your husband was feeling through all of this.
That's a very, very powerful query you've just asked, but a very important one because I think the emotions are multiple. They're vast and they happened, like I say in my book, simultaneously, sequentially, all at the same time. They show up at any point within that journey, not just the acute phase. And I think that's the really important bit. These emotions continue, but I think they are, I mean, what I experienced, and for many of the parents that I spoke with for my book, experience as well, there are about seven that comes up consistently, no matter what. And it's anger, anxiety, fear, lots and lots and lots of guilt, a lot of grief. And then there's shock and disbelief within that space, and this feeling of being overwhelmed. Like I was talking about sucker punch, not being able to breathe. And I think for me, I felt all of them at various points in my journey, and sometimes honestly still do, depending on what comes up. But I think the one that I think speaks the loudest was the grief, and not necessarily not just the grief of our four children that we didn't get to hold. It was also the grief of expectation, what's supposed to happen, the grief of and I say this very loosely, a normal pregnancy, the grief of your future, your life changes. It has to change, when you're dealing with additional needs. So there were so many layers of that one emotion that comes up. And interestingly, I say it happens it happens at different points of your journey. Even now, I'll tell you an example of that. My son, when he turned 16, all of his cousins, all of his friends were getting their driver's license, and he couldn't. And so, and he was very, very aware, where everyone is driving except me. And so there was another, oh wow, sucker punch. Oh yeah, he won't ever be able to drive in the way that we drive unless they cure blindness. And so, although through all of these things, we're there's so many ways of how you can get around them. And we're very much, a glass half full type of family, but there's still the reality of, oh, this is something that I'm grieving, that
Yeah.
actually now he's grieving as well in a different way. So those were the things that came up for me. And I think the other part, the other emotion that comes out that I don't really talk about that much is anger, because we feel like, oh, we can't be angry about the situation, but it does exist. It's just as valid
Yeah.
as any of the other emotions. And then I think with my husband, we've talked about this just really recently, to be honest, because we didn't really talk about how we felt. You don't even feel like you have the right to talk about it, even with the people that are closest to you. Isn't that's kind of wild that that we hold it so deeply in, and we don't really share what we're experiencing and what we're feeling. But I think for him, he talks about feeling like the silent parent. I mean, I'm sorry, the invisible parent. He called it invisible parent because oftentimes, especially when you're living within this space, the fathers aren't really, they're not really addressed. They're
Right.
not really talked. The mothers are either, but the fathers really aren't. And so he thought many times, or even though he was there, he wasn't seen.
That's very insightful. It's something I had not thought of, nor wouldn't have. So thank you for sharing that, and thank him when you speak to him for allowing his story to come and be part of this, because trauma affects us all. And of the
Yes.
7 emotions, so you've mentioned your book a couple of times. I'm going to give the title, and then we're going to come back to it because I don't want to get into it too much now. But Gigi's book is got an amazing title, From Roller Coasters to Carousels is the title. The subtitle is a little bit longer, An Emotional Support Guide to Healing for NICU, Bereaved, and Special Needs Parents. And I also want to, for those listening that may not know, NICU is Neonatal Intensive Care Unit.
Yes.
And it's a very common place for premature children to spend anywhere from a week to months and months, depending on how premature they were. And I've got personal experience that because all 3 of my grandchildren were preemies, and all 3 of them spent time in the NICU. It's an interesting place filled with hope and fear both, and you can speak to that a whole lot more than I can. We'll come back to the book because, like I said,
Yes.
I'm thrilled with just engaged with the title. But on the emotions, we all grieve differently, and
Definitely.
no one can tell us how to grieve. So
Yes.
when you talk about your husband feeling like the invisible parent, I feel that. And how would you suggest anyone going through trauma as a partnership where one person seems to bear the brunt of the trauma? What is the best approach for a couple or a family unit to try to deal with that trauma?
I think there are a few ways, but I think the thing that comes out the most for how to deal with it within the family and also people who are outside that unit, friends, family, etc., is to just acknowledge that it's happened. That's so is so important because oftentimes, like I said before, it's happening so quickly you haven't actually really had a chance to process it. But just to say, "Wow, this happened. This happened." And so that acknowledgement is huge. Is huge. And I think that sort of the flip side of that is also saying, I really don't know. I really don't know what to do with it. And that sounds like, it may sound like, okay, that's kind of a hopeless statement, but it really isn't. Because one of the things that's so important when you're dealing with trauma and you're dealing with grief is to not, what I say call empty, well intentioned, but empty platitudes. It's okay. It'll be better next time, you know, whatever it may be. And people are so well intentioned when they say that, but it makes it worse. So sometimes just saying, you know, wow, this happened. I don't really know what to say, but I'm here.
That actually is one of the questions I was going to ask because
Um,
even though we all experience trauma, not all of us experience directly or on such a personal basis.
yes,
And a
yes,
lot of us really do need advice on what is the best thing to say because I believe most everyone is very well intentioned, but saying
for
things like
sure.
it'll be okay or it was God's will or anything to
Yes,
try to just justify it, typically in my experience is said more from the perspective of helping the person speaking get through dealing with the person that has the trauma, as opposed to really doing something that might be a benefit to the person with the trauma. Tell us more
hold on.
about your experience and help us understand the best way to approach people with trauma or any type of special need.
Yeah, and I think you've sort of hit it on the head, and that is so important is to recognize, you know, what are you saying and why are you saying it? Are you saying it for your benefit or for the others? And oftentimes it's the simple things that are most powerful. like I said before, the acknowledgement. I don't know what to say, but I'm here. Just letting them know that you're here. Sometimes silence is golden, just holding someone's hand. And then the other thing that I've benefited from, and I know other parents have as well, and other people who've experienced trauma, is to ask, "What do you need?"
Uh,
And we feel fearful about saying that, but how else would you know? And what do you need? And they may at that in that moment, they may not know, but
mhm.
when they have the awareness, maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, hey, so and so said, what do
Yeah.
I need? And another thing that kind of is I guess a parallel to that goes hand in hand is being is offering very practical support. Like I said, I talked about being there. When you're in when you're experiencing trauma, you're anything that's considered normal just doesn't happen. So
Mhm.
you probably don't eat. You're not going to the grocery store. You're not, you're just in that. I feel oftentimes that, you're in a constant battle of life and death. So you can't really think about anything else. Several people made us meals. It sounds so basic, but it was so powerful because we had not eaten and didn't
Yeah.
even remember we had not eaten, you know,
Yeah.
or going to do so some of those practical things. If you're near someone, maybe going shopping for them or offering to wash their clothes, do their laundry, or if they have other children, being able to sit for them because they have to be at the hospital all day, all night. And so it's those types of things that are incredibly powerful and useful to sort of
Mhm.
help the person experiencing trauma heal because they don't
Yeah.
have to they can't they don't have the capacity to think about all these other things that's happening outside that they need to pay attention to. They can only focus on sort of the here and now.
Yeah. I've experienced some loss myself recently, and a couple of funerals in a couple of days. And the
Mm-hmm.
second one, the preacher spent most of his time talking about dealing with grief and grieving, as opposed to platitudes for the deceased. And there was plenty of that, don't get me wrong. But one
Mm-hmm.
of the things he said was, if you're really caring about someone who has lost, someone who is grieving, one of the worst things we can do is say, "Hey, if you need me, let me know."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, and it just made so much sense. It's like the last thing they want to think about is, should I call Joe or Jack or Sally or Bill?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you know what? Just bring him some chicken. Everyone gets hungry, and who doesn't like chicken? So, so I take that to just to build on what you say, because what you just said reinforces exactly what he said just last week, and that is, offer to do something or just do it.
Yes,
Just do it,
yes,
unless it's somehow being too intrusive. So, talk to me
right.
about that.
Right. And I guess it goes back to just want to piggyback what you said a second ago and how that connects with this is it really also depends on your connection with that person because everyone
Mhm.
you like you said earlier, you prefaced it by saying everyone grieves differently and everyone grieves differently depending on their own life story. How you show up to a traumatic space is going to very much depend on what's happened in your own life, on your own family experiences, your dynamics, your cultural experience, et cetera, et cetera. So those play a part in it, but you are right. It's one thing that cuts through all of that is this idea of being present with people, being really present with them because people we all know even if we're going through something really bad, we know the people that are with us,
Mhm.
like really with us, and the people who are just there. I say present but not present,
Yeah. I
you know.
I that resonates with me, and
Mm,
let me go back to and tie it back to something you said earlier, because you've pointed out, in the case of a lost child, an angel baby, as you call them, it's kind of an invisible, quiet, unnoticed, be by yourself, solitude type of grieving. So a lot of people, I assume, don't even know that you're grieving and don't know what you've gone through unless they are very close with you. And yet the grieving and the anger and all the emotions are there. Do you have suggestions, or do you just share your experience on how you deal with when you're grieving and other people have no idea and they're just happy chappy, laughing, joking, and it's just not working for you.
Yeah. Wow, that happens more often than not. And I think that part of that too is because you don't, for lack of better words, particularly when you lose a pregnancy versus a neonatal death, so a baby that was actually born and then passes away. It's almost this weird scenario of where you don't have anything to show for it,
Hmm.
except a scan, a sonogram, you know. So, but like you said, it's a very private space. And so the query was like, what do people do, when you're kind of happy go lucky? And I think that happens with anyone who suffers grief, who suffers a loss, who's in trauma. The world continues. The world is continuing to just roll with the punches. And I think that's where it's so important to have your community, your tribe. And that tribe could be a tribe of one or a tribe of 10 or a tribe of 20, but whoever it is that's in that space. And it's not always family. I mean, some of the worst things were said to me by my family. It could be people your chosen family, your friends who really understand what you're going through.
Hmm.
But that's looking at sort of the external thing. One of the other things that's really important, I think, is when you are going through a traumatic space is to journal and to really write down what you are experiencing. And I've done this, and I know other people have done this. Is sometimes that actually helps because you don't have the words to sometimes to share with others what you're experiencing. But when you take a moment. It doesn't have to be. We're not writing, a novel. It's just those kind of raw emotions. You can write it in bullet point statements. You can write them in pictures. But though just getting it out from within outside is very therapeutic for you, but it also helps someone else to assist you. But when you talked about the sort of personal bit of it, when people don't know, I think it's difficult, but also it's not really. I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way. It's not necessarily fair in some ways for others to expect to know what you're feeling.
Hmm.
And that's why I say it's important to kind of have your tribe
Yeah.
because no matter what you're experiencing, people don't know, they won't know, A, that you've experienced it, but also how deeply it cuts within you because everyone does it, everyone has a different way of managing this. So I think that's why it's so important for you to have your community, that whatever that support system is. But I think if there are people around you, it's so important for you to be able to, how do I put this? Be able to just share, even if it's, I can't be in this space right now.
Hmm.
Yeah, and to leave. I've known that to happen. I've done that myself where you just cannot be in that space until you have to leave. And and this is the last thing I think about this is it's important for you, all of us, when we're going through trauma, that we own our own story. And part of that ownership is you get to decide and choose when you share it. So you don't
Hmm.
have to share your trauma with everybody, any and everybody. You can if you choose to, but you don't have to. And that knowing that you can choose to do it with a certain person, a group of people, that's also very empowering, but it also gives you choice and it gives you a sense of direction. And that's so important when you're talking about trauma because you feel like all your choices have been taken away from you. What you
Hmm.
expected to happen didn't happen. So even being able to say, actually, I don't want to yourself, even, I don't want to talk about it right now. I can't talk about it right now is important. And and the people around you, if they are really with you, they will get it. They'll understand.
That is just so powerful, Gigi. Thank you. Let me go back to when you talked about writing it out. One of the things I work with people on is doing exactly that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
part of the reason for that is it's therapeutic to write. Another reason I find it very powerful and beneficial for myself and those I work with is it starts to make things I'm going to use this, and I hope I'm not saying this incorrectly in your situation, but it makes things real. When I keep something in my head, in particular when emotions are high, it can bounce all over the place and take all sorts of different shapes and sizes and different meanings. So if we start to write about it, it starts to make it a little bit more concrete, a little bit more uh, real. So I think that's a very strong thing. The other thing you talked about is just communication in general, in
Mhm.
particular with the tribe. Uh, what I want to ask you though, your trauma has been significantly in the area of lost children, but as a trauma informed certified coach, obviously you have training and skills outside of just, I don't want to minimize it, but beyond the trauma from lost children.
Mhm.
Can you help us understand just what is trauma? How would you
Mhm.
define trauma?
Mhm. Um, for me, trauma is like being on a fast roller coaster ride that you didn't ask to be on. You are literally going at 1,000 miles an hour, and you feel like you can't you can't stop it. You can't get off it. And I think that's why, I mean, one of the things that, when I said earlier about loss is multidimensional. So it's loss of a person, but it can be loss of so many things, and so when you're experiencing trauma, which is this huge feeling of distress, of out of controlness, if that's such a word, of I cannot fathom what's happening to me, whether that's a death, whether that's an illness, whether that's loss of your job, whether that's loss of we have a catastrophic, we're dealing with a catastrophic natural disaster. All of these things, there's this sense of shock, of, is this really happening? Is this really happening? So I think as when I work with people, I work with individuals and teams and companies and stuff, when we're dealing with trauma, which is something that the unexpected is happening, and it's affecting you deeply. It's stopping you from moving forward in your thinking, in your ability to just physically move, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for me, that's what trauma is. It's something that's so catastrophic, and it's important. It's okay if it's not catastrophic to anybody else. It's catastrophic to you, that is stopping you from going forward. It's stopping you from moving.
So would it be fair, Gigi, to say that trauma is induced oftentimes by something that has a major impact on us that was either unexpected or unwanted, and that we have no control over the fact that it is or has happened?
Yes,
Because you
yes,
touched on several examples. I mean, loss of life, loss of job, loss of
yes,
relationship,
yes.
any type of loss, it can be traumatic. Go ahead.
And and it's the key thing I think about trauma is distressing, and you feel like you cannot move forward on it.
Hmm.
It just feels like it's such a weight to where you can't move forward. So the distressing part too, because you can have someone who loses their job. Maybe they've been working for 30, 40 years with the company, and they're happy about it. You know what I mean? Like, it's not traumatic for them. So the key part is something that has occurred, unexpected, and it's distressing to you, and you just feel like, oh wow,
Yeah.
this is almost, it feels almost insurmountable, where I can't even process what's going on. I think that's the difference from an event just occurring and an event that's occurring that's distressing and stopping you.
I think you just to expand on something you just said,
Mm,
grieving is different for everybody, but trauma is different for everybody. So when I asked you earlier, what would you
mm,
suggest people, how do you suggest people speak to someone in a traumatic situation? What's traumatic and for someone may not seem that way to us. And so the get over yourself line uh, is probably not real helpful. So someone losing a job, career might just go bury their head in the sofa and not know what to do for a period of time, and someone else might just say, okay, I'll be out this afternoon, there's other jobs for me. So trauma itself is individualized. Does that make sense?
Yes, because it very much so. Because also, you got to think about. I said earlier about how it really depends on your own life story. A loss of a job, especially if you've been there for a career, you've been there for 30, 40 years, it's a loss of your identity. Who am I now? We see this a lot, even in athletes, sort of elite athletes that, they've spent their entire lives training to get to the Olympics. They get to the Olympics, they have no idea who they are after that.
Hmm.
And so that feeling of what just happened, so that's why I said like loss can mean multiple things. So
Hmm.
it's not solely loss in the traditional sense, the way we think about it. It could be loss of a number of things, and it really much depends on that individual person. And that's why it's so important when we're sort of, I guess, outside looking in, that we don't look at that person's situation from our own lens, because it's never going to be the right lens.
Right.
We have to look at that situation from that person's lens, and the only way we're going to do that is with permission, entering that space with them.
So what you're saying is very simply in one word, be empathetic. And empathetic doesn't mean sympathetic. It means
Exactly.
as best we can, try to understand where the other person is emotionally, physically, and in their life, and
Yes.
attempt to figure out how it's affecting them. And tendency, because we're all selfish as humans, and not focus on what how would that affect me, and so it's very simply, I'm here with you.
It is, and it when you say it out loud, you think, oh wow, it's a simple concept, but how incredibly difficult it is for
Hmm.
people to do that, because oftentimes we listen to respond, not to hear. So when we're listening to other people, we're not even, I hope this is not, that your listeners aren't doing this, but I mean, but when we tend to listen to other people, we're not actively listening. We're already forming our response. Okay, I
Hmm.
had an experience 10 years ago just like that, or I knew somebody's mother, sister-in-law, cousin, brother that went through the same experience. We're already conjuring up in
Yeah.
our minds what we're going to say. And that's incredibly different from us. I always say there's power in the pause, like putting the pause button on.
Hmm.
And I'm really listening to what you're saying, but I'm also listening to what you're not saying. And sometimes that's even louder and more
Yeah.
important. And
Powerful.
so you're right that the power of empathy, of really being able to walk in that person's shoes. You don't have to fit in those shoes. You're not expected to fit in those shoes. It's just, well, I see, you have to understand it. I hear what you're saying,
Hmm.
those words, because you're hearing what they're saying. I can understand how that just like, blindsided you and knocked you off your feet when you understand their story. And that means you're right. We all have biases. We all have, kind of assumptions that we make. And we have to check that at the door when we're trying to be supportive of someone who's been in a traumatic space, and leave that judgment behind.
Okay.
Because I always think about it in this way, part of the empathetic perspective is you have to think, well, what would I want? How would I want somebody to respond to me? And not that you're asking them to do it in the same way, but it's that questioning, that you're taking a moment to just pause and think, versus just, okay, let me just go right in and say what I always say, do my traditional sort of placards of, okay, I'm here for you.
Yeah.
I've got this, those kinds of things.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it. However, I'm going to make a little bit of a caution,
Mhm.
because if we look at something and say, how would I be affected? I don't know. Grieving's different, trauma's different, everything's
Yeah.
different. So I know what you're saying. Try to understand that we would have an impact, But the risk there is don't take it to the point of trying to bring what would be my solution to someone else's trauma.
No, it's not that at all. And I apologize if it's came across that way. It's not that. The only reason I'm saying that is to encourage people to pause and to
Yes.
really think about, okay, what am I saying? And or or when I say how would I want, part of it is I just want someone to be here or
Hmm.
to listen or to be, and it's not to say, oh, in my situation I will do X, Y, and Z, because that's not it. It's not it. But it's very much around that pausing bit. And I think within trauma particularly, because there's such a desire in human nature to fix it.
Hmm.
I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make it better for you, that we forget that sometimes we just need to be in that space. We just need to be there for that person.
We think that if we make it better for them, what's behind that curtain is it's making it better for us. Um,
Right, right.
so
That happens a lot. It's a very good point you just made, because particularly people who have experienced loss, no matter what that loss is, they oftentimes say that part of the silence, part of the shame part, part of the I don't really want to maybe talk about it, is because people will say, or they feel like they have to make it better for the person, the external
Mhm.
person, So I'm not going to talk about, that I'm really feeling like rubbish here. I just, because it's going to make Bill not feel comfortable. So I'm not going to say it. So we spend a lot of energy trying to take care of the other people versus ourselves.
Yeah. So I want to bring something, thank you for clarifying that. I want to bring something to the attention of the listeners that may have already picked up on it. You just said, and everything X, Y, and Z. That's very much an international term, something that we in the U.S. don't use all that frequently. But I do want to bring that up and use that as a segue because Geeky is based now in London.
Yes.
But you have lived on several continents, North America, South America, Europe, and maybe more. I'm not sure. But I want to bring that up to ask you this. Are there differences in different cultures about how people deal with trauma or how people perceive trauma or how to deal with that person? Or is trauma kind of generic across culture?
I'm going to kind of at least try to answer it in, I guess, in slightly sort of point A and point B. I think the first thing is how we respond to trauma. What I've experienced is, and with the sort of my work and sort of a lived experience as well, is how we experience trauma is it doesn't really matter where we are. If we're no matter which part of the world we end up in, when something happens, those emotions I talked about, you're gonna, in some form or fashion, feel some of that, experience some of those. But the query around, does, depending on, are there cultural differences to how we experience or manage or deal with trauma? Yes. And those differences can be within your own family, within your own society, within sort of what's expected. I mean, I think about, in some Asian and African countries, so you bury first. So you would bury, or, first, and then the grieving process, the sort of expected grieving process, can be up to a year. That happens in some religious communities as well. And so I think that's a very good point to bring up, because when we talked earlier about, how do you support people who are, experiencing some level of trauma, it's also very important to take into consideration, if you're in a different space other than your own, or different state, or different, religion, a different country, is being incredibly mindful of that. And doesn't make you be less empathetic, but
Hmm.
it makes you, it should cause us to be much more aware.
And frankly, I will say that doesn't make you less empathetic. That makes you more empathetic if you're
Makes you
attempting
wait.
to understand the culture, the situation, the religion, which was a great point you made. All of those factors come into play in how we strive to understand someone else, in particular if it's a different culture than ours, if it's a different religion than ours, if it's different anything than ours. It's
Yes.
that much more important in my experience to attempt to try to say, let me put myself in that position and best I can understand.
Yes, yes, because with that you're showing a level of empathy and level of love and respect to that person
Hmm.
going through that. And again, it makes it goes back to what we said earlier about, so it forces you to sort of check your biases at the door, how your, whatever culture you're coming from, how you do that, it may or may it be completely different to how someone else does that. And I think that, part of when you're dealing with trauma, and I say this even with the people that I work with in these spaces, the judge is so filled with judgment because it's oftentimes not talked about. But when you're working through that, the judgment piece has to be removed, or and slow. It's a process of doing that because it's sort of almost times, when you're experiencing trauma, sometimes you feel so judged. Some of that is self
Hmm.
judgment. I did something wrong, but reason
Yeah.
this didn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. Or, society sort of judges you. And so I think it is. I think it's, a lot of what we're talking about is really about, I talked about earlier about trauma being like that fast moving, roller coaster that's going all over the place. And part of how do you begin to heal from that, and how do you help others heal from that, is putting that pause button on, slowing
Judgment is
down a
very
bit.
much an inhibitor to empathy and understanding because we come up with a solution and we write the end to a story that's not our story. You've mentioned we're running up against time. I appreciate so much the time you've given. We're going to go a little bit longer than I suggested we might. But I do want to jump back to your book because you've alluded to it a couple of times in the title. I'll just from roller coasters to carousels,
Yes.
and I believe it publishes in June of this year.
Yes, on June 3rd, so next
To be
Tuesday.
specific, okay, so June 3rd, that will almost certainly have been published once this episode airs. So tell me a little bit about the title and tell me what one might find in that book. And again, timeliness, I respect your time, so give me the time that you can, please.
Okay. I appreciate that, Bill. And I think so roller coasters to carousels is really that. It's symbolic. The title is symbolic of what I'm wanting to do with the reader together. We're walking together through this book, and we're moving from the sort of chaotic, often jarring experience that trauma can cause us to feel like most people who go trauma say they feel like they're on an emotional roller coaster. They
Mm,
use that terminology because it's loops after loops. You're up and down. You're all around. Just when you think you're kind of halfway breathing, another loop comes in, and it can be manifested in so many different
yeah.
ways. So that's the roller coasters bit, and the carousels bit is we're moving toward a sense of calmness. Things will still occur. You still have some, so it's not static. It's not still. The movement is still there, but hopefully it's not so jarring. And as we're working together through the book and going through the emotions, it's the emotion based book. It's not the chapters. It's very much looking at the emotions that come, the 7 common emotions that come up. The idea is that when you're moving from trauma to healing, you're moving from despair to hope, and you're doing it. What I'm encouraging the readers to do is you do it at your own pace. So when I said about it's emotion based, you can jump to, and I really actually encourage the reader to jump to whatever emotion it is that's showing up for them, that maybe they're more curious about, maybe they're struggling with. Maybe it's anxiety. For one person, maybe fear. And then we work through that together.
I think it's brilliant that you constructed the book that way, because it's just like you said, and we've been saying throughout the entire episode, we all grieve, behave, think differently, and the emotions are going to come at different times. So I might need to get into that book and read your bit on anxiety, and someone else might be saying, "Give me that book. I got to get to the anger chapter." Uh, and so being able to get at it that way is very sensical.
Yeah, and and that was, I'm just mindful of time, but I just want to say that was intentional.
Hmm.
And really because of what, to your point, is, we don't experience trauma in a chapter by chapter. First you're going to experience this, then you're going to do this, then you're going to experience that. We don't do that. So your healing should also not be that way. It's wherever, all I say, you start wherever you are. And that's how I do in my coaching practice. That's how I do in life. You start where you are. There are no right or wrong answers. It's where you are, and we will get to wherever you need to be. So there's
Well,
a
that's certainly
freedom.
perfect.
There's a freedom in that. I feel there's a freedom in that process because you're allowed to heal in the way
Mhm.
that's more meaningful for you. And we will there be guidance? There's guidance along the way, but you also have the choice to decide how you want to show up in that space.
Yeah, my roller coaster might have a great big dip where someone else's might just have a hard left turn and someone else might be slowly on the rise. So that just makes the analogy that much better. So again, I'd mentioned that we're up against time. I do want to ask you the question I ask all of my guests, and you can answer this in any way, shape, or form that you want, relative to anything we talked about or relative to nothing that we've talked about. But very simply, Gigi, what's the point?
The point is healing is possible.
Healing is
That's
possible. That
healing is possible.
that might be the strongest three-word response I've ever had to that question. And that gives hope, and that gives optimism, and that gives fact. And your story uh, says that in what you've gone through. People, if you want to get in touch with Gigi, her contact information is in the show notes. A link to her book, which again will, you're probably hearing this after it's already published, which is great. So you can just go straight to wherever you buy your books and get a copy of it. Gigi, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insight. My empathy with the losses that you've gone through, but my gratitude that you've taken that and turned it into a positive, not just for yourself, but for countless others. And you've given that gift to people and that you may never know, but the ripple effect is going to be powerful. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Now I'm going to get a little teary, but I do appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. And if you like what you've heard, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We can promise there is value to be gained in every one. Taking a second to rate, review, and share the show helps make us more discoverable and enables others to find out what's the point. If you'd like to learn more about Bill Ellis and his services, please visit his website, billellis.com. See you next time.